In 1974, in Menominee, Wisconsin, an important event took place. This was a time when popular fashion included bell-bottoms and platform shoes, the Vietnam War was ending, and forensic DNA technology, which would later transform crime solving, was still far off. During this period, Mary Schlais, a bright 25-year-old University of Minnesota honors graduate, was violently killed, making her case a cold one that puzzled investigators for 5 decades. Nevertheless, due to persistent effort, advancements in science, and the innovative approach of investigative genetic genealogy, the truth finally emerged, providing closure to her family after 50 years. Born on the 11th of November, 1949, in Champlin, Minnesota, Mary Kathleen Schlais was raised in a big family and developed a deep love for art early in life. She became increasingly passionate about drawing, and by the time she was in high school, she was convinced that art was her destiny. Mary studied fine arts at the University of Minnesota, focusing on both painting and sculpture. Her instructors soon noticed her extraordinary talent, convinced she had a unique gift and a bright future ahead. Mary's commitment led to multiple scholarships, and she graduated with academic distinction. Her artwork was featured in many exhibitions, which was a considerable accomplishment for an artist at the beginning of her career. Besides her art, Mary was also keen on learning, studying internationally, becoming fluent in German and Danish, and starting to learn Japanese. Following graduation, Mary kept pursuing her artistic interests and traveled whenever she could. Since her painting wasn't earning her much money yet, she lived frugally, sharing an apartment with a friend and carefully saving her earnings. She often hitchhiked when traveling between cities or states, as this was a common way to get around back then. Public transportation was frequently unreliable, particularly in smaller communities, and not everyone owned a car. Buses ran infrequently, making it hard to travel between cities without a private car. Notably, in the 1970s, hitchhiking wasn't seen as dangerous. Stories of people going missing or being attacked didn't spread quickly, so most people felt safe doing it. On the 15th of February, 1974, Mary, aged 25, was getting ready to go to an art show in Chicago. The trip from Minneapolis, which was about 400 miles, was too far to complete in one continuous drive. She planned to hitchhike to Madison, Wisconsin, first, and then continue on to Chicago. At approximately 10:30 a.m., she left her residence with a Madison sign and headed for the highway. About 3 hours later, a man named Dennis was driving on a country road in nearby Wisconsin. He saw a parked car with a man and a woman standing next to it as he turned onto a long, dead-end road. As he drove by, it looked like they might have been arguing or even fighting, though Dennis wasn't completely sure what he saw. He kept driving, but the image stayed with him. After a few minutes, he reached the end of the road, turned his vehicle around, and drove back. When he returned, the car was no longer there. However, he noticed something in the snow and realized someone was lying beside the road. Dennis remained in his car. Instead, he rushed home and told his wife what he had witnessed. He then asked his neighbor to come with him, and they both went back to the spot. When they arrived, it was undeniably clear that Dennis had seen a person, a young woman with blood-stained clothing. They promptly drove to the closest house and called the police. Upon reaching the scene, officers confirmed the young woman was dead, having suffered several stab wounds. However, something felt wrong. There wasn't much blood in the snow, indicating she was likely killed elsewhere and then left at that spot. Police found a man's hat near the body, which they thought could belong to the killer. Crime scene investigators tried to cast tire tracks nearby, but the snow kept the material from hardening correctly. Without any other immediate physical evidence, the body was sent to the medical examiner for more examination. Meanwhile, police interviewed Dennis, their only witness, hoping he could offer useful details. According to his statement, he saw a slender white man, probably 25 to 35 years old, around 5'8", tall, with light brown hair. The car was described as a small gold sedan, but Dennis didn't remember the make or license plate number. Concurrently, the medical examiner determined the victim died from blood loss, having been stabbed approximately 15 times. Numerous defensive wounds on her arms clearly showed she tried to fight off her attacker. Yet, there was no evidence of sexual assault, which ruled out what could have been a clear motive. As the case progressed, the coroner finally identified the victim as Mary. Police spoke with Mary's roommate, who informed them of Mary's plan to go to an art show in a different city. The roommate also said Mary had taken her purse, which was conspicuously missing from where the crime occurred. Since Mary left home around 10:30 a.m. and her body was found about 3 hours later, detectives created an approximate timeline. The trip from her home to where her body was found would have taken about an hour and a half, heavily implying that the person who picked her up in Minneapolis was her murderer. Based on Dennis's description, police developed a composite sketch of the suspect and distributed it to local newspapers, hoping someone would recognize him. Some tips came in, but none helped investigators identify the killer. At the same time, detectives started viewing Dennis as a possible suspect for various reasons. They knew he was on a secluded, dead-end road, and no one else confirmed seeing the other man he mentioned. Parts of his account also appeared contradictory. Dennis stated he had visited the store that day and, on his way back, chose to keep driving for a bit longer. When asked about this strange detour, he explained that his dog, who was in the car with him, apparently wanted a longer drive. This explanation caused considerable skepticism, especially since Dennis had driven onto a rarely used dead-end road. Another suspicious detail was how Dennis acted when he found the body. He didn't get out of his car or call the police right away. Instead, he drove home to pick up his neighbor. Police were only called after his neighbor had personally seen the body. Investigators thought Dennis might have been trying to create an alibi, or at least separate himself from the crime. Nevertheless, some facts also suggested he wasn't involved. For example, the tire tracks on the road didn't match his vehicle. Even so, detectives couldn't completely dismiss the idea that another car might have simply driven by before the murder. Police also found no proof that Dennis was in Minneapolis that morning, meaning he probably didn't pick Mary up directly. Still, this wasn't definite. It was possible Mary had caught a ride with someone else initially, and then later ended up in Dennis's car. Police kept questioning Dennis, but he stuck to his story. They even hired a hypnotist at one point, hoping to uncover any forgotten memories or concealed information. Both attempts proved unsuccessful. Interestingly, among the tips received by police was an anonymous letter advising them to examine Dennis more closely as a possible suspect. Yet, the letter provided no new details or proof, only a general caution. Facing no progress there, investigators started looking for other potential leads. This search brought their attention to an unsolved case from 2 years prior. In 1972, a young woman named Jolly from Minneapolis hitchhiked home, and her body was discovered near a river outside the city 15 hours later. Detectives started investigating a potential link between Jolly's and Mary's cases due to some clear resemblances. Jolly's friends last saw her entering a gold car, driven by a young man. Similar to Mary's case, the medical examiner found no indications of sexual assault. However, despite the obvious parallels, the investigation into Jolly's murder had also not produced any strong leads. Investigators carefully searched for any connections between the two cases that could lead to a suspect, but all leads went nowhere. In the months that followed, detectives looked into many possible suspects, but none could be firmly connected to Mary's murder. They also found a few witnesses who claimed to have seen a man resembling the sketch driving a gold sedan, but these leads too were inconclusive. Ultimately, the case became inactive because investigators couldn't find any new leads to advance the investigation. Over the next few years, the case was reopened several times, but each attempt hit the same insurmountable obstacle. In the early 1980s, police speculated that Mary's killer could be Randall Woodfield, a serial murderer serving a life sentence who admitted to killing 44 people. Since most of his victims were hitchhikers, he was a reasonable suspect in Mary's case. Yet despite the similarities, detectives could never establish a definite connection between Woodfield and Mary's murder. For years afterward, investigators chased hundreds of leads across almost every U.S. state and even into Canada, but still couldn't identify Mary's killer. Eventually, Mary's murder grew into a local legend, especially in the county where her body was discovered. People started reporting odd sightings of a young woman appearing to hitchhike along the road, only to disappear instantly when observers looked away. 2 fishermen asserted they saw a similar woman by a lake, describing her as softly glowing white light, silently observing them from afar. Later, a local woman claimed that a murdered woman named Mary frequently visited and communicated with her. As the case remained unsolved, these paranormal tales eventually eclipsed the actual crime, leading many to forget that a true tragedy was at their core. In the early 2000s, with DNA analysis established as a common investigative tool, detectives chose to try again to find genetic evidence of Mary's killer. In 1974, medical examiners had discovered traces of the attacker's blood and skin under Mary's fingernails. This evidence had been carefully stored for years, but experts, unfortunately, couldn't get a usable DNA profile from it. Nevertheless, one vital lead persisted: the hat found near the crime scene, which had also been kept as evidence. Inside the hat were a few short strands of male hair. Forensic experts tested these strands and successfully obtained a partial DNA profile, but again, they encountered a roadblock as there were no matches in the FBI's database. Yet, the effort wasn't pointless. That DNA was enough to conclusively exclude several previous suspects, including the serial killer they had once considered, whose DNA was already on record. The case stayed cold for several more years until late 2022, when detectives learned about the new DNA technique of genetic genealogy. Believing this could be their last real chance to solve Mary's murder, they reached out to a New Jersey college lab specializing in this research, and the lab agreed to help. The experts began their work, using the partial DNA profile taken from the hair inside the hat. The partial nature of the DNA profile made the process much more difficult. Nevertheless, after a lengthy and complex process of combing through public genealogy databases and building potential family trees, they eventually identified a possible suspect, a man who seemed to meet all the required characteristics. The next step was to get a DNA sample from him. Detectives found him, and he willingly provided a sample. Surprisingly, the DNA did not match. The analyst then suggested another possibility. Perhaps the killer was the man's first cousin. Detectives followed this new lead and collected a second DNA sample, but again, it didn't match. The situation was puzzling. It was clear that both individuals were close biological relatives of the killer. This was undeniable. However, no one else in their known family could possibly be the suspect. At that point, experts proposed a new theory. What if the killer was adopted? This would account for his absence from the known family tree. The team began carefully examining old records to explore this possibility. On the 4th of November, 2024, they finally found what they were looking for. Given all the information they had unearthed, it was highly probable that the biological relative they were searching for was 84-year-old John Keith Miller. Detectives started looking into Miller's past and soon learned he had a daughter. They contacted her, and she agreed to give a DNA sample. When the results returned, they were exactly what detectives hoped for. The hair from the hat at the crime scene matched her father's DNA. In that moment, 50 years after Mary's murder, investigators had finally identified her killer. Immediately after the lab confirmed the DNA match, detectives went straight to Miller's residence. Almost immediately after being presented with the DNA evidence, John Miller calmly admitted his guilt. He stated that on the day of the murder, he picked Mary up by the roadside, assuring her he would drive her to her intended location. However, once outside the city, he started pressing her for sexual acts. When she resisted, Miller took out a knife and stabbed her repeatedly. He then drove down the secluded dead-end road, planning to bury her body in the snow. As he was pulling her from the car, another man drove past. Panicking, Miller quickly got back into his car and sped away, leaving the body by the road. He recalled seeing a newspaper article about the murder the next day and feeling relieved. It turned out the witness had incorrectly identified his car's color. Miller stated he was driving a light blue car, not a gold one, at that time. Ultimately, he claimed he felt almost no emotion about his actions and had rarely thought about it since. Miller also told detectives he threw the murder weapon into a swamp near his house, but couldn't remember what he did with Mary's purse. Asked if he had killed anyone else, Miller denied it. He asserted he didn't even truly know why he had killed Mary. After his confession, he was formally charged with murder and arrested to await trial. Miller, however, indicated he had no intention of fighting the charges. He said he would plead guilty, not wanting to go through a long court process, and confirmed he was prepared to spend the rest of his life in prison. In March 2025, John Keith Miller entered a no-contest plea to a first-degree murder charge. He was then sentenced to life in prison and ordered to pay $2,200 in restitution, definitively concluding the legal process. Therefore, detectives finally managed to solve this complicated case, despite it taking 5 decades. Even though Miller is almost 85 and probably won't spend many more years in prison, Mary Schlais's case has finally reached a conclusion. Regarding Jolly's murder, Miller's involvement now appears unlikely. Since he was driving a car of a totally different color at the time, it's very possible he wasn't involved in that crime. However, investigators are still checking if he's linked to any other cold cases, but they haven't found anything connecting him to more murders. For Mary's niece, Nina Mary Schlais, the case's resolution was deeply significant. Nina Mary Schlais stated, "Mary Schlais was not just a victim. She was a brilliant, independent woman, a talented artist, a horse rider, a world traveler, and a scholar." She remarked that the result of this long and difficult investigation powerfully demonstrates that justice has no time limit, giving hope to other families still enduring the painful uncertainty of unsolved cold cases. A young student on her way home after an evening with friends vanished, setting in motion a case that investigators initially believed would be simple. The events that followed, however, stunned the nation. As disturbing revelations emerged, public anger erupted across Australia and continues to resonate. Audrey Griffin, born in 2005 in Australia, was a passionate and serious athlete from childhood. She dedicated herself to rigorous training and built an impressive record of achievements in triathlons, rugby, and water polo, competing with a drive to win. She even placed 23rd in her age group among hundreds of competitors in a major triathlon in New Zealand. Beyond her athletic pursuits, Audrey was known for her vibrant energy, determination, and genuine kindness, which drew a large circle of friends. After completing high school, she enrolled at the University of Technology in Sydney to pursue a degree in marine biology. During this time, she also developed an ambition to serve her country in the military, setting her sights on the Navy. At 19, as she was finishing her second year of university, she decided to enlist. Before commencing her service, she planned to spend time with her father and grandparents in the small town of Arena, where she also had many friends she wished to say goodbye to before starting this new chapter. On the 21st of March, 2025, Audrey spent the day with her family, including a visit to her hospitalized grandfather. The following day, her friends hosted a farewell party for her at a bar in a neighboring town. Audrey enjoyed her time and decided to leave for home at approximately 2 a.m. When a ride-sharing app failed to find a cab, she decided to walk towards her father's house, intending to catch a taxi on the main road. After saying goodbye, Audrey set off on her own. An hour later, her friends tried to contact her via text and phone calls to ensure she had arrived safely, but they received no response. They grew concerned but reasoned that she had likely made it home and gone to sleep. The next morning, Audrey's mother, who was in Sydney, used a smartphone app to check her daughter's location. Her heart sank when she saw the phone's location was near a local river, far from her father's residence. She called Audrey's father, who confirmed Audrey had not returned home. He mentioned she might have stayed at a friend's house, but a call to that friend confirmed she wasn't there either. Realizing something was seriously wrong, Audrey's friends alerted the police and went to the river where her phone's last signal was recorded. There, along the shoreline, they discovered her purse and a hair clip. Police officers and Audrey's father arrived shortly after. As they continued to search the riverbank, they noticed something in the water. Tragically, it was Audrey's body. The medical examiner's initial finding was that Audrey had drowned, leading investigators to believe her death was a tragic accident. They theorized she might have slipped and fallen into the river in the darkness. However, her family and friends vehemently rejected this conclusion. Her mother insisted Audrey had not been drinking and, as a skilled swimmer accustomed to strong ocean currents, would not have drowned in a shallow river. Furthermore, they pointed out that her fingernails were broken and her jacket was torn. Despite these inconsistencies, the police initially treated the death as an accident. For days, her parents heard no updates, and the case received minimal media attention. Frustrated, her family and friends continued searching the area themselves. 3 days after her death, a friend of Audrey's mother found her phone partially buried in the mud, in plain sight. This discovery fueled the family's anger, as it suggested a lack of a thorough police search. Taking matters into her own hands, Audrey's mother visited every business along the route her daughter had walked. To her dismay, none had been contacted by the police. Weeks passed with the family relentlessly pushing for a proper investigation. Finally, detectives agreed to open a full inquiry. On the 17th of April, nearly a month after her death, police publicly requested help identifying a man seen on surveillance footage along Audrey's path. They stated he was not an official suspect but a person of interest. The footage was of poor quality, making identification difficult. Then, on the 21st of April, detectives made a sudden announcement. They had arrested 53-year-old Adrien Torren in Sydney and charged him with Audrey's murder. Police then shared the findings that led to the arrest. Pressured by the family, a deeper investigation was launched. Reviewing CCTV footage, they saw a man walking several hundred yards behind Audrey. A resident near the river reported hearing a high-pitched scream around 3 a.m. that night. Another witness, who was walking his dog, recalled passing a man who seemed nervous and twitchy, and his description matched the man in the surveillance footage. With the accident theory crumbling, a more detailed forensic analysis was ordered. The medical examiner found multiple scratches on Audrey's arms and abrasions on her face, consistent with a blow. The most crucial discovery came from skin tissue found under her fingernails. DNA testing matched it to Adrien Torren. The new theory was that Audrey had fought her attacker, who likely held her underwater. The arrest brought the case to national attention, and subsequent revelations about Torren's past sparked public outrage. His ex-wife, Michelle, came forward, revealing she had lived in fear for months due to his repeated death threats. They had married in 2020, but his kind demeanor soon gave way to fits of rage. In early 2024, after he punched a hole in the wall near her face, she left him and obtained a restraining order. Torren violated the order almost immediately, calling her 34 times and leaving 24 threatening voicemails. Despite this, police were unable to locate him for 5 months. He was finally arrested in January of 2025, at which point Michelle discovered his extensive criminal history, which included drunk driving, drug offenses, and assault. In 2019, he was sentenced to 20 months for assaulting a girlfriend, but served only 4. Despite his repeated offenses and the violation of the restraining order, a judge granted him a form of probation instead of jail time. Torren walked free, and 3 months later, he murdered Audrey. The public was incensed that the justice system had allowed a dangerous man to remain on the streets. Compounding the anger was the fact that it took police nearly a month to investigate Audrey's death as a potential homicide. Her mother later revealed that she had to demand police review the CCTV footage, which led them to discover Audrey was being followed. She also recounted a baffling interaction with police after the arrest, where they told her they couldn't question the sleeping suspect yet. Torren never confessed, but a wiretapped phone call before his arrest captured him, admitting to a friend that he had killed Audrey. Saying something inside him just snapped. The prosecution had a strong case. In a final, tragic twist, Torren was found unconscious in his jail cell 3 days after his arrest, and later died at the hospital, an apparent suicide. The news was a devastating blow to Audrey's parents, who sought not only justice but also answers that now died with him. His ex-wife noted that he had started calling and threatening her again on the very evening of the murder. Audrey's story highlighted systemic failures, prompting widespread calls for reform. She was the 23rd woman killed in Australia in 2025 alone, and her death ignited fury over the government's perceived inaction. In response, a resolution in Audrey's name was introduced in Parliament to strengthen preventative measures. The Prime Minister also initiated an investigation into the police department and the jail involved in the case. Across the country, thousands gathered at memorial events to honor Audrey's life.